So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how corn diseases and our risk for corn disease is impacted by moving that planting date either up or back, depending on our weather conditions. So we all know that in order for disease to occur, three things have to happen. We need a susceptible host. So in this case, a hybrid without resistance to that pathogen, our disease-causing pathogen, and then also an environment that's conducive for disease to develop. So this environment part of the triangle is what I'd like to focus on in today's talk, and thinking about how a planting date moving back or forward can impact our environment and our risk for disease. So thinking about those earlier planting dates for corn, that's going to create a perfect scenario for a lot of our seedling diseases. And that's because we're typically experiencing cooler, wet soils in those early April planting dates. And that's going to create an environment where a lot of our fungal and fungal-like pathogens that can cause seedling disease really thrive. So in corn, seedling disease and seed decay, it's caused by multiple pathogens, and they're typically interacting as a complex. So we can have fungal pathogens like Fusarium and Rhizoctonia species, as well as fungal-like pathogens that you may hear referred to as water molds or oomycetes like Pythium. And when we're experiencing seedling disease in corn, our first tip off is usually just a reduced stand. So going through that field and seeing loss of stand, and then digging a little bit deeper, doing some scouting and noticing plants that are scattered throughout that field and perhaps more concentrated in low-lying or areas that are just prone to lying wet in those fields. And in those plants, we can see symptoms like wilting, as well as stunting, early plant death. And so a really key symptom we can look out for here in this picture here, we can see we've got a rotted mesocotyl, and that's going to have long-term impacts throughout the growing season. Because remember, at this point in that corn plant, our mesocotyls really are our main funnel for water and nutrients, connecting the radicle and seminal root system to that growing point until our nodal root system's established. So that's going to have impacts with that mesocotyl and being able to pull up those water and nutrients. In addition to that reduced stand, like we talked about earlier with Taylor and Osler, if we have that reduced stand, it's of course going to have yield impacts at the end of the season. So there are huge benefits of those early planting dates for corn, but just keep in mind, as we move that planting date up, we're going to need to adjust our management accordingly. So especially for the seedling diseases, one way we can do that is seed treatments. So looking into fungicide seed treatments. Pay attention when you're choosing those products with your retailers that you're paying close attention to the active ingredients. So for example, Pythium is going to require a different active ingredient like metalaxyl for control because it's not a true fungi, it's that water mold, compared to our fungal pathogens like Fusarium or Rhizoctonia are going to require a different active ingredient. So pay mind to active ingredients and then also your rate. So if we know we have histories with a high history of seedling disease, we may want to look into that label and see if we can increase our rate and still stay on label to get better control from those seedling diseases with that seed treatment. So early planting, it's going to increase our risk of seedling disease because we're creating that environment that they really excel in, but also because we may have just a longer period that those seeds are exposed to different stresses. So diseases, yes, but also insects and different weather stresses, especially frost. And that's because, as we know, if we plan that late March to mid-April timeframe for Ohio, we're probably going to need a longer time period to germinate and emerge because we just don't have the same heat units that we do with our later planting dates. So we could go from a typical 5 to 7 emergence window all the way to about 2 to 3 weeks. So that's going to increase the amount of time that those seedlings are exposed to those different stresses. And like we saw in soybeans with the seed corn maggot and increased disease pressure and weather problems, probably all three of those are going to interact and really have some detrimental effects. And keep in mind, even with that seed treatment, we can have leaching, like Taylor saw in the Worcester location for soybean. But even without leaching, these seed treatments are typically only offering protection for about 3 weeks. So when we have those longer emergence periods, we're running the risk of losing that seed protection and just having more chances for problems to arise with seedling diseases. So I know planting date's the focus of this morning, but there's other planting factors that can impact our environment and increase our risk for seedling disease. And based on some recent work by soybean and corn pathologist Allison Robertson at Iowa State, they've shown that cereal rye cover crops can serve as a green bridge, so to speak, or a host to different corn seedling pathogens because they are both grasses. So though cover crops have lots of benefits like nutrient retention, weed suppression, and ground cover, one trade-off and one thing to keep in mind is that they can serve as that reservoir for the seedling pathogens in corn. And so what they found at Iowa State was that they had higher pathogen populations following that cereal rye cover crop compared to having no cover crop or having that fallow period during the winter months. And what this means is when we have cool, wet conditions, especially in those fields where you are following a cereal rye cover crop with corn, pay attention, prioritize that seed treatment and make sure you're scouting for stand loss and any problems that could arise. But by and large, for our typical planting dates in Ohio this year, we didn't see a lot of seedling disease. And that's probably because of that dry spell that we already talked about earlier this morning that started mid-May and went all the way into June, about till June 21st for where I'm at in the state. So right here, I've just got some weather station data from the three locations, Worcester, Western, and then Northwest research stations. So let me move this real quick. In gray, we have our precipitation from 2023 for the month of May compared to our normal precipitation that we receive in May. So you can see that we had a 58 to 70% less precipitation in May than normal. And what that means is we didn't have much seedling disease probably because of those dry conditions. So remember that disease triangle, we didn't have the environment that was conducive for those pathogens to start causing disease on our corn plants. But what about foliar diseases? So Taylor did a tremendous job scouting all these locations once a week throughout the season. So paying attention to those seedling diseases, but then also as the season progressed, our three main foliar diseases that we have in Ohio, including northern corn leaf blight, gray leaf spot, and then tar spot. So a reminder on what we're looking for when we're scouting for these three diseases. The first, northern corn leaf blight. This is caused by a fungal pathogen, and the symptoms that we are keeping an eye out for when we're scouting in the field are these longer elliptical or cigar-shaped lesions on susceptible hybrids. In scouting for those, especially 1 to 2 weeks after we have maybe some heavy dew or fog periods, this fungal pathogen really thrives in those wet, warm, high humidity conditions. Second foliar disease that Taylor rated for and we need to scout for in Ohio and actively manage for is gray leaf spot. So when we're looking for this disease, keeping an eye out for these more narrow rectangular lesions. And similar conditions to northern corn leaf blight, slightly warmer temperatures, but really loves those humid conditions, especially if we maybe have some river bottom fields or those that are lying lower in a valley, depending on what state that you're in. They're really going to gravitate towards those fields where we have that heavy fog, high humidity. That's where this pathogen is really going to thrive. And then lastly, a relatively newer corn disease for us in Ohio, and that's tar spot. So another fungal pathogen that's able to overwinter in Ohio. Here we're looking for these small black raised spots called strumata, and that's the fungus itself on that corn leaf. And I have these two pictures here. So this is from the 2022 growing season. And I keep these just as a reminder. This is from the same cornfield. The only difference is time. So in about 2 to 3 weeks, we went from just a few handful stromata to really that entire leaf being blown up with those stromata. And now we can start to see that yellowing behind those tiny black raised spots as well. And then the environment that's going to favor tar spot infection are milder temperatures. So mid 60s to mid 70s for about 30 days. And then also leaf wetness early on in infection. So if we can get that 7 to 8 hour period of leaf wetness, that's going to promote infection. And then we've got those mild temperatures, it's going to cause these stromata to start occurring about 2 to 3 weeks after that initial infection. So when Taylor was out in these plots, she gathered 2 points. One, it was the disease incidence. So when we talk about disease incidence, this is just yes or no, was that disease present on the corn plant? So we've got 10 different corn plants here, and we record that we've got 3 out of 10 showing some symptoms of disease. We would have a 30% disease incidence since 3 out of 10 of those plants are showing symptoms. So a yes or no, is that disease present? And that disease incidence was combined with a severity score. So severity is now asking to what degree is that disease present? So in this case, looking at a number of ear leaves on that corn plant and doing a rough estimation of the percent of leaf area that's covered by disease. So you can just see right here, this is from the Crop Protection Network. They've got a nice disease severity estimator tool that you can use to train your eyes before going out in the field. And so this is just simulating a northern corn leaf blight lesion on these corn leaves. And you can see we can have a range of severity from 0% all the way to 20% on that corn leaf. So Taylor gathered how many of those plants had disease and to what severity, and then combine those two to get what we called a disease severity index or DSI. So for today's presentation, just know that that DSI, the higher the value, the more disease we have, both from a presence and a level of severity. So starting off with tar spot, we saw that location and planting date did impact a tar spot disease severity index. So we have that value here on the x-axis for both of these bar charts. And then on the left, by location, so Northwest, Western, and Worcester. And then also by the 5 different planting dates in order. So location really had the greatest effect, and that makes sense. We go back to that disease triangle. We need to have that environment that's conducive to disease. So though Worcester probably had more of those early on seedling diseases on the soybean side and some on the corn side, by far Northwest had the most tar spot present. But it did seem like this year that perhaps that tar spot came on late enough that it didn't have a huge yield impact, since across planting dates, Northwest still had the highest yield. And then we can also see kind of a stair-step pattern as far as our planting dates go with that tar spot DSI, where as we move that planting date back, we had perhaps more tar spot pressure. And that's all going to depend on our weather conditions and when that disease infection occurs, if it does. In this past season, it seems like those earlier planting dates were able to maybe avoid that disease or have less of that grain fill period impacted by disease, simply by just having more growth and more development compared to those later planting dates. And then looking at how tar spot disease severity index was impacted by our relative maturity. Not as much influence as location and planting date. So we've got our 4 different hybrid relative maturities from 100 to 115 day, and roughly very similar levels of disease across the board. So tar spot, it is becoming more widespread in the Corn Belt. So this pathogen originates from Latin America and then moved into the United States and really started spreading in a significant way, stemming from Indiana and Illinois in 2018, 2019. And then we had another big year in Ohio for tar spot in 2021. So here in this map, it's just tracking confirmed reports of tar spot. So if a county is shaded in gray, it does have confirmed tar spot in any of our previous growing seasons. But I know talking to growers just in southeastern Ohio the other week, they've seen tar spot too. So I suspect there's more counties in Ohio that should be shaded gray than in this map. So it makes sense that Northwest maybe had more tar spot pressure because tar spot's been present in these northwestern counties in the state for a longer amount of time than the rest of the state. And we know now that tar spot can overwinter from one year to the next in our corn residue in our soil as stromata. So they can overwinter, survive our colder months. And then when we have the right conditions in that susceptible corn hybrid, then we can have lower canopies starting to be infected by those stromata that are in our soil and corn residue. And so we've got those mild temperatures, that initial leaf wetness. About 2 to 3 weeks later, we can have those symptoms or signs appear on that corn leaf. And then this pathogen does have the capability that if the environment's right, repeated infection cycles can occur and cause more disease to ramp up in that field. And then, of course, we can have early dry down, early plant death, and that infected corn residue is going to go back into that field and overwinter from one year to the next. But what I want to highlight is what we're finding with spore trapping in different locations throughout the Corn Belt is we want to prioritize hybrid selection and fungicide applications over residue management and tillage for tar spot. Though it's going to help, it's not going to make as big of an impact simply because these spores can also travel in through the wind and rain events pretty far distances. So at least over 4,000 feet from one location to the next. So keep that in mind if you're working with tar spot in your field. If you have a field history, making sure that you are considering a fungicide, doing scouting. So if we have a field history, likely going to occur from bottom to top on that corn plant, but also know that it can blow in from neighboring fields and pretty far distances. So even if you don't have a history of tar spot, keeping an eye out for it and proactively managing for it is going to be the best. And for management, that first step, that really cornerstone is hybrid selection. So seed companies are understanding more and more how their hybrids fare to tar spot. And as these screens increase and our knowledge improves, we can work with your seed dealer and making sure that we're identifying those hybrids that have some level of resistance. So this data right here is from Indiana from 2019 to 2021. So Darcy Telenko, their corn pathologist, has been doing a lot of tar spot work since it started in Indiana. And here we can see we've got a susceptible hybrid in red, and then 2 different resistant hybrids, both in green and yellow. And so our green resistant hybrid did have significantly higher yield than that susceptible. And even though this other resistant hybrid didn't have statistically significant higher yield than that susceptible hybrid, you can still see numerically quite the yield bump. So we do know that there is resistance available, and we need to prioritize that when we're selecting for hybrids for the next year. So manage first with hybrid resistance. And then secondly, especially with fields that have a history of tar spot, considering a fungicide application. So there's a lot going on here. So this is a foliar fungicide trial done by our corn and wheat pathologist, Pierce Paul, at the Northwest Research Station up in Hoytville, Ohio. And the first takeaway here is, compared to this check that had no fungicide applied, all of these other treatments that had any fungicide applied, so whether it was a 1-pass, 2-pass, varying products or timing or rates, they all out yielded that untreated check. And then their effectiveness varied by product. So in that teal color, we have either Delaro or Delaro Complete, purple, Veltima, and then in that gray, Miravis Neo. And then I have our 1-pass systems as a solid color, and then 2-pass systems with the striping. So keep in mind that fungicides can be a great tool for tar spot management, but we want to keep in mind the economics of it. So with product and application, you're probably looking at least $50 per acre for that treatment. So this red bar is showing just loosely the amount of bushels that we're going to need to pay for that fungicide pass, so that single pass of your fungicide application. So we can see these treatments most surpass that bar. The ones that really didn't were treatment 6 and treatment 11 that actually were a 2-pass system. And we'll see in the next slide that in this case, that first pass was done earlier on, so V6 to V8, and then that second pass was done at tasseling. So in this case, that first pass was probably just too early to get a lot of benefit. And then that purple bar is just showing that the number of bushels we need to get that 2-pass system to pay. And though we have some that surpass that line, there's some that are really just bordering it. So keep in mind when we're trying to consider whether a 1-pass or 2-pass system is going to make the most sense for your bottom line. And then overall, what Pierce and his counterparts are finding is sticking with those multiple mode of action fungicides, and then targeting that tasseling R1 growth stage period is going to give you the most consistent benefit. And this table is showing those same yield results sorted by the highest yielding treatment here was Delaro Complete. So when we're considering different fungicide programs, be thinking of rate. So even though this treatment 10, Delaro Complete with a 2-pass system, first at tasseling R1, followed by an R3 application, even though it was our highest yielding treatment, there was only a 6 bushel difference between a Delaro Complete with a single pass at tasseling R1, just with an increased rate. So maybe we can get as much yield benefit from that 1 pass if we can increase the rate and then reduce some of our costs by eliminating that second pass. And then also another caution when you're working with products, just keep in mind that name. So there are some that are really similar. So we've got Delaro and then Delaro Complete, and the difference here being that Complete is going to gain us another mode of action. So also keep that in mind when you're developing your program. And that fungicide use, it's going to be optimized if you do have the flexibility in your spray program to time it using some disease predictive tools. A new one that's available as a mobile app is Tar Spotter. So this is housed by the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but it does use modeling data and spore trapping data from Ohio. And you can download this to your phone, either Android or iPhone, and load your different field locations. It's then going to ask you whether you've had a fungicide application in the past 2 weeks, what growth stage are you at? So we want to make sure that we're targeting probably before R3 for any sort of application. Past that point, we're not going to get any benefit from that fungicide typically because we're moving too far into that growth period for corn. And then it's going to give you a risk forecast, and that's going to give you an idea of where and when you should be scouting, and then possibly considering a fungicide based off of that scouting. So use those apps, use those maps. So in the corn newsletter, we're often updating that tar spot incidence map that's managed across the corn belt. And then also be scouting. So when we're scouting, going through and looking for those raised black spots. And here's a video that we actually had for the Battle for the Belt series, where you can see an example where we didn't have tar spot. It was just insect poop or insect frass. So just a really simple test is using a wetted thumb and rubbing across that corn leaf. And if it rubs off clean like it did here, that's not tar spot. Those stromata are going to be embedded to the leaf surface. They're not going to be able to be scratched off. And then later on in the growing season, it can be easy to mix up tar spot with some of our rust diseases. But in that case, that rust, it will be able to erupt. And whereas that tar spot, remember, it's just going to be embedded into that leaf surface. So tar spot, it's a newer corn disease, and it does have the ability to cause really significant yield loss and some loss in standability at the end of the season. But we don't want to lose sight of other corn diseases that we need to be managing for in Ohio. So to steal a phrase of University of Wisconsin-Madison's pathologist Damon Smith in a past webinar talked about tar spot tunnel vision. So we want to avoid focusing solely on tar spot and losing sight of other diseases like gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight. So here we've got Taylor's disease severity index by location for gray leaf spot here on the left, and then northern corn leaf blight on the right. So northern corn leaf blight, really probably low levels across all locations, 8, 2, 6 as a DSI. And then for gray leaf spot, we saw a lot more in Worcester. Other corn diseases to factor into your management plan, especially for fungicide timing and hybrid selection, are our ear rots. So in our Great Lakes area, it's something that we're constantly battling, is all of these different corn ear rots. And then starred here are the ones that Taylor was able to do ratings for as well. And then typically one of our more common ones here in Ohio is gibberella ear rot, which is not a stranger to any of you on this call, especially because of that mycotoxin, DON or vomitoxin that fungus can produce that's going to cause reductions in our grain quality and our ability to market that grain. So looking just at gibberella ear rot and then diplodia ear rot, overall by location, Worcester had the most ear rot. And so what that might be indicating between that gray leaf spot being higher and that ear rot, we might just have more humidity in our Worcester location. So that might be something to look into from one year to the next if that trend holds. And then planting date had a less influence on ear rots than that tar spot where we saw that stair-step pattern, just kind of a sporadic DSI cross planting dates for gibberella here in the left. And then for diplodia, possibly like a slight spike in that pattern for diplodia ear rot in our planting dates 3 and 4, but not as much of an influence as compared to location and our environment, which isn't a surprise. So in summary, tar spot, it's becoming more widespread, and that means we need to prioritize our hybrid selection and fields that have history or in an area that have tar spot in the past, making sure that we're considering a fungicide use and paying attention to product, active ingredient, rate, and timing. And optimizing the timing of that fungicide pass, both by scouting and using those different predictive models that can give us a heads up when our risk is higher than we would expect. But don't lose sight of those other disease threats, especially gibberella ear rot. You know, that can cause hits on our yield, but also grain quality and being able to market that grain at the end of this season. And then, of course, not relying on just one management tactic. So thinking about seed treatment, fungicide, hybrid selection, crop rotation, different ways that we can manage for those diseases in the field. And then lastly, early planting, it can increase our risk of seedling diseases, uh, but in my opinion, that's not a barrier to maybe gaining the benefits of that early planting from a yield or agronomic perspective. It just means we need to shift our management and our perspective and prioritizing possibly that seed treatment um, or avoiding fields that we know are going to lie wet and have poor drainage that's going to promote some more of that seedling disease infection.